Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jamira Burley.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Are you asleep because of lunch? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Now, I know it's going to be hard to follow up the one and only Nancy Pelosi, but I'm going to try because I think I have two awesome women who are going to join the stage. And for those who don't know, my name is Jamira Burley, and I currently serve as the senior campaigner at Amnesty International, leading on issues of gun violence and criminal justice. Growing up in Philadelphia, I am no stranger. Whoop, whoop. Growing up in Philadelphia, I am no stranger to how violence could become inexplicably linked to young people in criminal justice. Watching individuals get swallowed up by the school-to-prison pipeline, and watching young people unable to get jobs after becoming incarcerated has inspired me to dedicate my life to becoming a vehicle for criminal justice reform. I've made it my mission to use my personal experiences as the driving force to improve the lives of others. With that in mind, it gives me an honor and privilege to introduce two amazing women who needs no introduction. It gives me pleasure to introduce Michele, sorry, I'm gonna get her last name horribly wrong, Jawando, who is the Vice President for Legal Progress at the Center for American Progress. Woo! Yep. She will also be joined by another favor of mine, Tisch Sussman, who is the senior campaigner for Center for American Progress. Please welcome these two ladies to the stage. And since unfortunately only women can show up on time, no shade to the men in the audience, hopefully we will also be joined by Senator Cory Booker later on in the program. Thank you.
Yes, I love Make Progress. You guys are awesome.
Woo!
Yes.
Make progress.
Make progress. Well, I am so excited to be here today. I am no Senator Booker, although we are vegetarians, so I feel like we have that in common. But today we are going to talk about a little bit more serious topic than just being a vegetarian, although I'm happy to speak to anyone afterward if you want to talk about that. But criminal justice is something that has brought together widest spectrums of the country and made alliances that I think we never really expected to see in this day and age. I could not be any more excited to be up here with Michele. Michele is really leading our organization, leading the fight, and bringing together so many pieces of all that happens in DC to move forward on this issue. This is an issue that we need new ideas in Washington. This is something that the ideas that we have are tired. They're not working. Everyone knows it's broken, but nobody really knows how to fix it. And one of the things I think is most important, why we should really talk, it's so important for us to talk about in this space, is that this is one of the strongest examples we have right now of an issue that is bottom up.
That's so true.
This is not something that is coming out of Washington. This is coming from you guys. This is coming from young people all over the country. So Michele, I want to ask you about that. When was the moment that you saw, we have countless examples all over the country where people are saying, enough. But what do you feel like was the moment that you saw and you realized something's going to change? Something's going to change in Washington, in states all over.
So hi, Make Progress. How you guys doing today? All right. So I'll probably be doing some call and response because I have to make sure you guys are feeling me today, all right? All right.
I'm in.
So I'm all about the call and response. So, when we think about kind of this opportunity in this moment, we are kind of at the precipice of the system falling and breaking apart in on itself. Why? Because we have spent the last 20 to 30 years over-incarcerating and over-criminalizing so much of our American lives, and disproportionately, that's affected poor people and people of color. Yeah. And this isn't something that you don't know about, right? So much of this movement, the reason why it's been so exciting is because it's been happening from the ground up. And I think where we are now is that people from so many different sides are saying, listen, this system doesn't work. It's costing taxpayers, you sitting right here, $80 billion a year. $80 billion a year. So that's how you kind of get some of our friends from the libertarian and kind of the conservative side of the spectrum. And then when we bring our friends from the kind of traditional civil rights and racial justice work, we know that this system disproportionately is affecting people of color. And that you can be charged for the same crime. But if you are an African American, then you are likely to get a sentence that is 6 times as long than one of our white brothers and sisters. And so I think we're at this place where we're like, enough is enough. Too many people are upset about it, and we got to change it.
Yeah, absolutely. But so when do you think it was, we saw there was a lot of grassroots movement around particularly police shootings in communities. And it did take a little while, but we did see the Department of Justice step in. So that was a place where the government was actually coming in. And of course, when we think about, our breakdown of our branches of government, like that's executive at the highest level, right? Like we're not seeing it necessarily from Congress. But when did we have that tide shift that people said, it's gonna happen in Congress? Like something's gonna happen, we're gonna have to change the laws. Like when did it go from being a problem that was individual to people, that was individual to communities? What was that tipping point that said, now it's a system-wide problem?
So if you've participated in a march, a protest, online day of action in the last 6 months, stand up. Stand up. If you participated in a march, an action, an online day of action in the last 6 months, stand up. Raise your hand. Be counted. So this was the reason why Congress said it's time to pay attention. Because we really haven't seen kind of that level, thank you everybody, that level of engagement, we hadn't seen it in so long. But people were literally being killed on the street. And so we had so many people who were saying, like, enough is enough. And so one of the reasons why I think Congress has now been forced to respond, and the only way, I'm a former Senate staffer, the only time Congress pays attention is when there's enough action and attention that forces them to pay attention to a situation. And so over the last 6 months, and really I think after the death of Trayvon Martin, we began to see a movement that was really built. And then you saw the intersections with so many other movements in this country that were saying, you know what, it's time for us to come together and take a stand. And so I think the combination of both this kind of renewed activism, whether it was building on the kind of 99% movements where you saw in New York City and parks were being taken over, and then you brought in kind of a lot of the social justice, same activism that we saw throughout the civil rights movements, that people coming together in those ways really catalyzed this movement in a renewed way, because Congress had to respond. They had constituents literally doing sit-ins in their offices saying, how are you going to respond to this? And if you didn't, then you were just callous. And so now we're at this moment where Congress is saying, yep, we see it, we recognize it, and we want to be responsive.
But I want to ask you about that accountability. I mean, is that accountability really real? Because a lot of the communities that are rising up because they're feeling disempowered, either against their own local police or their local elected officials, also have a lot of barriers to engagement, to civic engagement, whether it's getting on juries because people are not in the voter pool, whether it's voting at all, whether once they're registered, there's not access. And so there's so many barriers to then electing the officials that are really representing them that people just really aren't having that access and accountability. So how do you think those two issues are really interplaying between the barriers in civic engagement and reform to criminal justice? Like, do you think electeds really do feel accountable, or do they feel like we've successfully pushed people enough out of the system that I'm not really accountable?
So I would say that there are a few things happening. So like if you think about what's moving on, what's really forcing elected officials on a statewide level, it's not because everyone has kind of had this awakening. A lot of it is centered around their budgets, and they can't afford to keep on doing what they've been doing. So that's where we've seen a lot of the reason why people are coming together at a statewide level. And then when you think about what's happening in Congress, some of the kind of coalitions that are being built are strange bedfellows, but there's also this generational divide. So who knows about the 94 crime bill? Raise your hands. Raise your hands. Okay, so in 1994, when crime rates were going down across the country, Congress moved forward on the 1994 crime bill. And unfortunately, it had some of the most kind of draconian policies that we've seen and that we're really still dealing with. It had kind of increased mandatory minimums. There were kind of this myth of the kind of scary, particularly young person of color who was coming to attack you in your home. And so kind of dealing with that whole, we need to be tough on crime, Congress passed through this 94 crime bill. There are still a number of members who are in Congress today who were there in 1994. And some of those members don't necessarily want to concede that they made a mistake, that they were wrong. But how many of us know that it's okay to say, I made a mistake, I was wrong, I want to do the right thing, right? Like, that's what life is, that's what growth is. And so now we're kind of at this place where members of Congress, you'll see some of the coalitions with kind of Senator Booker and Senator Paul and Senator Lee and Senator Durbin from Illinois. And some of that is generational, right? They're saying, listen, we grew up with these policies. We know they weren't working, and we want to do something that's better than what we've been doing. And we're facing resistance, not just from people on one particular kind of ideological background, but some of this pressure and some of the reasons we can't completely break open the system is generational. And one of the reasons why we're trying to get everyone in here engaged on this is while we know that this is a special moment, that movements are happening in the street, we can't lose sight of the fact that Congress has to pass these laws, and we have a really short window to make that happen. And so, yeah, we're talking about it, we're tweeting about it, we're writing about it, we're doing marches in the street, but we still gotta pass a bill, y'all. And it's not that simple. And so we're trying to get everyone here really engaged and feeling the pressure of the calendar, of the clock, of this moment, because if we let it pass, it could be another 20 years before we get a chance to do something.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of that, there is a very strong connection between who we elect into office and whether we see change through law or just change through culture. Equally important, but we do need to have both. You know, you mentioned this idea of it being generational, and you and I have worked on issues that are generational before. Michele and I actually worked together starting 5 or 6 years ago on LGBT issues, and that's a very generational issue. And part of what we saw there is that it was the young people, it was you guys really, that convinced the older generation, said, you know, you have stereotypes about who LGBT people are. That's not true. It's my friend, it's me, it's our cousin. And so people thought to themselves, oh, it's in my family. I didn't even realize. So it was almost like we snuck people in, right? Like snuck them right in and came right out. But that's not gonna happen on this issue. That's not gonna happen here. We still do have stronger barriers there. So what I'm hearing you say, and I think that we've experienced this in campaigns, is that telling the personal story, making the personal story heard, is something that's gonna humanize it. It's not that 1994 scary black guy coming in. That's not who's being locked up, and that's not whose lives are being imprisoned. So how do you think we tell those stories in a different way through that generational lens?
So I'm from New York. Where's my New Yorkers in here? Woo! All day, all day. And so I had the honor and privilege of working for Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, Team Gillibrand. And you remember we were having these kind of debates and conversations about stop and frisk in New York City. Now, my husband and I, in the midst of these debates taking place, less than a mile from our home, were stopped, right? Pulled over. And, you know, that was an experience. It wasn't the first time we were stopped for driving 20 miles per hour less than a mile from our home. And we went into kind of auto mode, right? You put your hands on the dashboard, you don't make quick movements, you tell the police officer, or my husband was telling the police officer, sir, I'm going to go into my pocket, I'm going to pull out my wallet and show you. Now he, at the time, was working in the White House. I, at the time, am working for Kirsten Gillibrand from New York. And we're having these conversations, but at the highest levels of government. But at the same time we're having those conversations, we're being impacted directly. And so I remember the next week you come into the office, and how many of us know that there's some kind of sometimes shame and stigma when you have an interaction with the criminal justice system, right? So here I am, I'm writing laws, I'm talking about legislation, and I made a decision when we were sitting around the table. I'm the only African-American senior woman in that role. And we're having these conversations, and it was very theoretical. It was like, what does this mean if we do this? And I had to say, Senator, this isn't theoretical. This happened to me last week when my husband and I were stopped and pulled over to the side of the road. And the indignity of that moment wasn't because we did something wrong, but it was because of what we looked like. And because I had worked for the senator for 6 years, because the senator knew my husband and knew my family, she got pissed off and was like, why did that happen to you? But I'm like, Senator, it doesn't just happen to me. It happens to people who look like me, who get judged because of where we live or where we come from. And so I need you to be the voice for people who, like me, will be affected but won't ever have the opportunity to change and to fix the system. But in that moment, I also had to take the risk that I would say, here, I had this interaction with the system. This impacted me personally. This wasn't theoretical. And so sometimes we don't want to tell our stories because we're ashamed. But that's my story, and when I let that story give it power, when I take that opportunity in that moment to say, I have an opportunity to impact policy, to change the way people perceive issues, I had to take advantage of it. I had to tell our story. And right there at that moment, the senator said, you know what, we're going to lead the way on the Racial Profiling Act. We're going to make sure that we sign on. We're going to speak out about it because this shouldn't happen in a country as great as ours. And so I say to you, don't be afraid to tell your story. We have to make this real for people. 100 million people in the United States have some type of criminal record. Now, a criminal record could be just an arrest without a conviction. It could be you did actually work your way through the system. But 100 million people, that means 1 in 3. So that means your mother, your brother, your sister, your cousin, your family member. This is not them, you guys, this is us. And until we make people recognize that it's us, we're not going to fix the system.
Yeah. Thank you for telling your story. It's incredibly important. Thank you, Michele.
I love you.
I love you.
Oh my God. We just had a moment, y'all. I'm sorry.
But what if you and Will weren't in positions of power, positions of I mean, you guys are incredibly confident, and so you don't have to necessarily be that nervous. Like, it was a nervous moment, but for what about the people that that are not in that position? Like, for what about the people that end up getting caught in this system and then they just end up in this cycle? You know, the fees you have to pay when you're in jail, the child support that you may get behind when you're in prison. the community that you come back to. Let's talk really tactically about what could potentially change in Washington and what is changing in states. Once you get into that cycle, what are the places where we think we're seeing movement? Where can actually change in the next couple of years?
So I know most of the people in this room are going to be overachievers, right? Because you're here, right?
Yeah.
You recognize your privilege. Give yourselves a round of applause.
It's true. You guys are awesome.
You guys are awesome. That's why you're here. You've been called for such a time as this. But raise your hand if you ever cut class. No. Now see,
okay, we'll get that together.
Okay, we're gonna work on you, brother. Okay, see me after so we can have a conversation. Okay, higher ed, not debt. Okay. So, if I told you that there are some states like Texas, who's here from Texas? Woo! All right, Texas, I'm going to throw you a little shade, though. Right? There are some states like Texas that until recently, if you cut class over a certain amount of days in the school year, you would either be arrested or had to pay a fine. And if you couldn't afford to pay your fine, you were arrested. And you could be locked up for as long as you needed to until you found the money to pay your fine. And if I told you that was happening to young people as young as 13, what would you say? Right, yeah, I hope so. Where's that boo? Yes. But unfortunately, there are so many ways that our communities interact with the criminal justice system that people don't know about. Because I think most people of common sense would say, you shouldn't go to jail if you can't pay a fine or if you cut class. If you're cutting class, let's figure out what's going on. Is there something else happening that we can't fix so that we can make sure that we're setting up a situation so that you can do better in school? But instead of us thinking through policies that would help those young people, we've thought about how we criminalize those young people. And so we have a system that we're trying to unpack because we've over-criminalized behaviors that never should have had any intersection with the criminal justice system, right? And so some of the work and some of the policies that we're trying to move forward now speak to this, right? We're trying to get away from locking up young people because of truancy. We're trying to get away from how, if you are someone who can't afford to pay a fee or a fine, a parking ticket, a speeding ticket, if you can't get your car out of the impound, you shouldn't be forced to go to jail because you can't afford it. Who are we as a country, right? Who are we as a country if we say because you don't have the means to do something, we're going to direct you into the criminal justice system? And that's what we've been doing for the last 20 and 30 years in this country. And it's a dirty secret that we don't talk about because we haven't yet had the will to do something. But I believe that we're in this moment where people like you are going to bring light. Whether or not you're talking about it online, whether or not you're writing reports, whether you're in the streets, whether you're thinking about running for office, you're taking those opportunities to shed light, which is the only way we drive out the dark. We got to shed light. We got to shed light.
Now, a lot of the examples that you just went through are ways that we have criminalized the system, right? Our system of living, our system of school. And so it feels like those are places, like those should be low-hanging fruit. How are we working with the other side? That's an interesting, it's an interesting challenge. And so it feels like that's where they should be involved. They should see that system. What is the response with the communities that were very pro-lockup? And are they necessarily where we think they are? Like, is it the right? Is it the left? Like, where's the opposition? That sounds crazy opposition to what you just described.
Right. But it's still very real. You know, in this country, we have often thought, you know, if you just do the right thing and you work hard, then you can do well. But that's not a reality for so many people. And it's not a reality, particularly for people of color and people without means in this country. It's not a reality for those who are dealing with mental illness or disability. It's not a reality for those of us who may have English as a second language, who have an immigrant story. It's not a reality. Because what ends up happening is for things that you don't think you would have any interaction with the system, someone says, no, you did the wrong thing, and you didn't, you couldn't earn your way, you couldn't represent yourself well, and so we're gonna refer you in some way, shape, or form to the criminal justice system. And so the opposition happens to be people who think, well, the folks who are in the criminal justice system, they're supposed to be there because they didn't do the right thing, because they cut class, or because they couldn't afford to pay a fee or a fine. Of course you should go to jail. And so we're still dealing with this mindset that I'm good and you're bad, you're over there, and so we're just gonna leave you over there. What did I tell you earlier? It's about the otherization of whole communities. We've put people over the side, and we didn't say that they were our friends or our brothers or our sisters or our colleagues or our coworkers. We said that's them over there with their problem, and they can deal with it, and I won't. And so until we really break those kind of divisions where people think that it's just those few bad actors and they deserve what happens to them, that's why we still see the kind of opposition. I also go back to the point about it being generational. We now have evidence, 20, 30 years of evidence that says over-incarceration does nothing to reduce crime rates. We're seeing some of the lowest crime rates that we've ever seen, ever. And yet we're still over-incarcerating people. So we know that over-incarceration is not connected to these lowering crime rates. That was happening before we even did that. These policies, what they were meant to do was create the sense of fear in communities. And if I could scare you into saying these people were trying to do something to you, then you would believe me and let me just move forward with the policies at work. And so now we're trying to change that. We're trying to tell those who before weren't standing with us, listen, let me show you some of the evidence and the data. Let me show you some alternatives to incarceration and what they look like. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the kind of reentry work that Senator Booker and Senator Paul are talking about. Let me tell you a little bit about mandatory minimums and how they don't lead to better outcomes. Let's talk about sentencing guidelines. And so we are having a brand new conversation with people that is brand new, but it has to happen. And I'm glad that we're seeing some energy and engagement, but the conversations have to keep on going.
Absolutely. And so I'm a tactical person, right? Like you give me a problem, I try to figure out what are the influences, what are the arguments on the other side, how do we insulate ourselves from them, and how do we raise up our arguments? So in this case, when we're talking about criminal justice reform, because it is so new, we think about like what are the different communities that are involved and how do they all get involved? And I think, because there are traditional civil rights organizations that are a little bit older. There are gun violence organizations that are involved in this. There are communities of faith. What role does this room play? Like what role do the young people play in this space?
That's a fabulous question. Now, who in here is energized and engaged? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Who in here has some type of social media platform? I'm very excited because I recently joined Twitter, so I tell everybody, I'm like so proud of myself. I know, don't laugh at me. At Michele Jawando, thank you very much. One of the things that you can do, who in here knows how to use a phone? Who in here knows where the Capitol is? The United States Capitol. Who in here knows where the capital for your state is? Who here has been to the Capitol in your state or here and nationally?
Ooh, great room.
Okay, so I just gave you 5 different ways for you to get engaged. There are so many movements that are taking place, and I know GenProgress and all of the team here will kind of continue to give you kind of insight of what you can do even coming out of this weekend. But if you have a social media platform, if you know where your capital is, you go and you make your voices heard. And you ask them, are you working on comprehensive criminal justice reform? If not, if you don't want to go there, tweet at them and say, hey, I just was at this amazing conference. Are you working on a comprehensive criminal justice reform package that will take out mandatory minimums to make sure that we're not moving forward with locking up generations of young people? Are you working on criminal justice reform to make sure that cutting class doesn't end you in jail? Are you working on criminal justice reform so that my children, when they grow up, live in a better world than I do? You all can do something. And that's the way you do it.
Michele, thank you so much. It was so wonderful to have you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys. Rock on.
Thank you.